Trailblazer here. I wanted to talk to you about armored vehicles in the 30-25 period of BattleTech. This is a period when armored vehicles could really kind of come into their own because the battle mechs of the period were so weakened by technological degeneration, and there were actually quite a few really nicely designed tanks available. So it was really a period when tanks could stand almost head to head with mechs and had very significant uses on the battlefield, even more so than perhaps in some other later eras. With that in mind, I wanted to start out with the armored vehicle of the time that I think does the best job of standing on an equal footing with battle mechs. As you'll see, in general I have a preference for armored vehicles that are light, relatively cheap, can take up a light vehicle spot on a dropship, which is a large advantage in operational terms, and that mount long-range missiles as their primary weapons. But there's a big exception to this in this period, which is the Manacor. The Manacor is really a tank that can fight a lot like a battle mech. It's got some heavy weaponry, it has a PPC for armor piercing, it has long-range missiles to hit at a range that any mech of the period could do damage at, and it's got some nice secondary weapons, so it really fights like a line battle mech. Fights like a battle mech, like a Warhammer, for example, of the period, where it can close with the enemy, shooting at long range, and then coming into close range, it begins to employ secondary weapons with crit-seeking capabilities. It has an SRM-6 for that purpose, along with a medium laser that it can start shooting. And the advantages of vehicles with their kind of built-in automatic heat management capabilities really come into play in this design, because it can continuously fire all of its weapons. Now that puts the commander of the tank in a bit of a bind in a certain way, because there's this kind of narrow sweet spot of ranges that you want to be at with a Manacor. You want to be at 6 hexes, because at 6 hexes your long-range missiles are firing fairly efficiently, your PPC is at short range as well, and your short-range missile and medium laser are at their medium range. So that's 6 hexes is exactly where you want to be with this vehicle. That's the location, the distance from your opponents, where all of your weapons are able to function at fairly high efficiency. So if I was to say what's the downside of the Manacor, it would be that you have to fine-tune your distance from your opponent in that way in order to get the most out of the tank. My next pick in my top 5 is a vehicle that does something that mechs really cannot do in this period. It moves fast and it carries a really threatening arsenal. This is the Drilson heavy hover tank at 50 tons. It's got a large laser, it's got LRMs, it's got a significant arsenal of weapons, and it moves 9 and 14, which is extremely fast for this period. So this is a vehicle with a lot of utility. You can do a lot of different things with it. You can do indirect fire with your LRMs, which is, as I show in one of my previous videos, which I'll link to in the notes, a really efficient strategy. But of course you can also rush up and use all of those weapons, get into a good position, and then if your hover skirts are destroyed, so be it. You're in close range. The vehicle has decent armor, so it's going to do some damage to your opponents. This is a premium vehicle, and even though you pay for it a bit, it is worth every penny. Now we're getting into some of the designs that do what I think vehicles do best. Long-range missiles are one of the most efficient weapons to mount on armored vehicles. They have excellent range, they provide indirect fire, and the indirect fire is a really important thing for vehicles because the big difference between mechs and armored vehicles is the vulnerability of the vehicles. The fact that motive critical hits and regular critical hits, or especially if you're using something like Inferno missiles against them, they can be taken out really quickly and fall down quickly against enemy fire. But if what you're doing is indirect fire with LRMs, then you're usually not vulnerable to enemy fire, or not very vulnerable anyway. So if you mount LRMs on a vehicle and aim to use it for indirect fire, that's an extremely advantageous way to protect those vehicles from their weaknesses. You sort of avoid all of the weaknesses of the vehicle by using it in this role. So in light of that, my number 3 pick is the Hunter Light Support Tank. The Hunter moves pretty fast. It's a 5.8. It's got solid armor protection, especially for a light vehicle, and it mounts an LRM-20, which is an excellent support weapon. You bring a lance of these with you, you've got really strong fire support, the equivalent of 2 archers, and it's all in a package that moves more quickly than an archer, so you can get it into a good indirect firing position. Because a tank only rises 1 level above the surrounding terrain, anytime you place it behind a level 1 hill, it will be protected from opponents across that hill. It's protected from them in the sense that they won't have line of sight to it. So it's very easy for a tank to get in position to begin indirect fire, which is another one of the advantages of the Hunter and other LRM armed tanks. In order to carry out that kind of strategy, it's best to have some speed on your side. The Hunter has pretty good speed, but even better is the speed of my next pick, the Scimitar missile variant. This is a variant of the Scimitar medium hover tank, which normally mounts an AC-5, which is a pretty crappy primary weapon, but the Scimitar missile variant replaces it with a long-range missile 15 launcher, which is quite a strong weapon. With this hover tank's 812 speed, you can really move to get into that firing position that is going to be perfect for your indirect LRM fire. And as I show in my previous video on employing missile hover tanks on the offense, this can be a really powerful tactic for attacking your opponent and forcing them out of favorable terrain positions. So the missile Scimitar is really a tank that has some abilities that are fairly unusual in BattleTech and can bring you a massive advantage on the right battlefield. And finally, my number 1 pick is a tank that ties for the most LRM firepower in this period, which is the missile variant of the Partisan heavy tank. The Partisan mounts 4 LRM-15 launchers for a total of 60 LRMs coming at your opponent every turn that this thing is firing. It has a 3-5 movement profile, which is enough to get it into position, and it has pretty decent armor. So the Partisan LRM is really a remarkably powerful defensive unit. It can even be used on the offense if you can find a way to move it up into cover in the right way. And it just provides an extremely powerful barrage for any tactic based around indirect long-range missiles. If you bring this tank with you into a defensive fight, which is really the situation in which armored vehicles thrive the best, it will not disappoint you. This is an extremely powerful combat vehicle.